Japan, a 20th century industrial giant which in less than 40 years rose from the ashes of World War II. Today we begin a special three-part series on the other Japan, its natural world, and its artistic and religious meaning to the Japanese people. This is the famous Toshogu Shrine in Nikko National Park. It's a great tourist attraction, which houses the immortal spirit of Tokugawa Ieyasu, Japan's first shogun. Back in the early 1600s, Ieyasu so feared the Christian missionaries' intolerance of other religions that the shoguns eventually banished all Europeans, effectively isolating Japan from Western influence for the next 2.5 centuries. Hi, I'm George Page for Nature. And until the end of the 1800s, the Japanese were not exposed to the Western Christian concept of man's domination over nature. The Shinto and Buddhist religions revere all forms of life and see man as a part of the natural world, not its master. The Toshogu Shrine has more than 10,000 carvings of plants, animals, and mythical figures. But the most famous is up there on the sacred stable. It's an image we all know, the three wise monkeys. This week we look at the living inspiration for the carving, the remarkable Japanese macaque monkey, whose natural habitat is slowly shrinking. Our film is called See No Evil. Driven by tectonic forces, the Pacific Ocean floor plunges beneath the Eurasian continent. Molten lava spews up, creating an arc of more than 3,000 volcanic islands. Japan. Stretching almost 2,000 miles from the semi-tropical Ryukyu Islands to Hokkaido's frozen shores, it's home to 130 mammal and more than 500 bird species. In traditional Japanese culture, man is not above, but at one with nature. Natural beauty, anything which evoked admiration, whether a living creature or a group of rocks, had its own kami or spirit. The people had a special sympathy for nature. Flowers and animals seemed to reflect their feelings, and many wild creatures became religious and artistic symbols. For many, the powerful symmetry of Mount Fuji represented the beauty of Japan herself. But today, visitors can drive up 2/3 of the way to pay homage to this powerful symbol. Under such pressure, her beauty lies tarnished. If this can happen to Fujisan, how much room can the people give their wildlife? The mountains which stretch down the length of Japan were once mysterious, remote, and impenetrable. They were revered by the native religion Shinto as the home of the highest earthly kami, or spirits. The monkey became the messenger of the Shinto gods. Legend says that monkeys helped carry the timber to build this shrine on Mount Hiei near Kyoto, where the monkey is still sacred. The monkey messengers communicated between the Shinto priest and the mountain spirits. According to one story, when the priests went into the remote forest to speak with the kami, the wild monkeys emerged. So the priest believed they had come to listen to their prayers. Kami dwelt in beautiful trees, stones, or running water. When priests placed offerings at these spots, the wild monkeys were again sent to collect them. "90% of Japan was forested when the macaques first arrived many thousands of years before the Japanese people. The macaques colonized most of the islands, from as far south as the first subtropical island to the northern tip of Honshu. At some time in prehistory, the Japanese macaque, a unique species, evolved. Japanese macaques, found farther north than any other primates except man, are known as the snow monkeys. They are social animals living in troops of 15 to 200 or more. The social structure is well organized. A dominant male, who often inherits his social position from his high-ranking mother, presides over a strict hierarchy. Macaques once lived in the lowland forests before these were felled around 300 BC to make way for rice cultivation. Japan is short of flat land, and soon the hills were terraced, pushing the forest wildlife into the mountains. Conflicts began as man and monkey competed for food. There were many early superstitions and folk tales about monkeys. In some, they were wicked or cunning, but in others, they had healing powers. Witch doctors traveled with tame monkeys to reinforce the patient's belief in their skills. From the earliest times, we meet a dichotomy. Sometimes the monkey is good, other times it's an evil omen. The macaques are primarily herbivorous, and in the northern deciduous forests, their diet changes with the seasons. In early spring, the macaques follow the receding snow up the mountainside, eating buds and shoots as they appear. Each morning, the troop travels in search of food, staying within a home range of between 2 and 8 square miles. Vocal communication helps keep neighboring troops apart, and fights between them are rare. The macaque shares its forest home with the Japanese sorrow, a goat antelope, also unique to Japan. Once almost hunted to extinction, it was given the status of a living natural monument. Today, its numbers have grown, and it may soon lose the protection of that special title. The sorrow is generally solitary, but the single calf born in spring will stay with its mother until it is 2. Another inhabitant of the forest is the Asiatic black bear. The mark on its chest has earned it the name crescent moon bear. But the black bear and the serow never attained the religious status of the monkey. Other creatures, however, had great significance. In these remote mountains, the howling wolves communicated the wishes of the deities. Today, only their statues remain. The wolf is now extinct here. In the lowlands, living around the rice paddies, the fox became the messenger of the rice kami. Fox shrines are still extremely popular because when the farmers left the land and became businessmen, they kept the fox as their messenger. The early believers had no need to build shrines. They simply worshipped natural beauty. A spot became sacred because it evoked feelings of wonder and awe. Later, as Shinto became more sophisticated, gates or torii were built to separate the spiritual world from the ordinary, and little wooden shrines housed the kami. Tall trees were revered. Like mountains, they were stepping stones by which the gods could come to earth. A rope of plaited rice straw, decorated with strips of bleached mulberry bark, indicated spiritual power. Messages were folded into shapes to charm the gods into reading them. People still buy paper fortunes at shrines, and they leave the bad or unlucky prophecies in the care of the trees. The macaque and hundreds of other forest species benefited from the worship of trees. Protected by the presence of kami, the shrine forests were wildlife sanctuaries. These religious precincts are still important as refuges for the macaque. Under the pressure of ever more intensive exploitation, their available habitat is shrinking every year. Another legacy of Shinto, which remains embedded in the Japanese consciousness, is a love for the changing seasons. Radio bulletins detail the progress of the cherry blossom as it moves in a tide up the country. By early April, the cherries are blossoming in Hiroshima. Their arrival has been celebrated since an imperial decree in the 8th century. They still herald the beginning of the school year and the promotion of employees to new positions. In May, the mountain cherry trees flower in the northern forests and the young macaques are born. The baby will grow up in the protective care of the truth, where it will become the center of attention. The mother will be groomed by her siblings and the older daughters, as they attempt to catch a glimpse of the baby or a chance to touch or hold it. In the 8th century, the monkey messengers of Mount Hiei were granted a new role, the protection of the emperor from evil. When the imperial capital was moved to Kyoto, Mount Hiei lay to the northeast, the direction from which bad influences were believed to come. The Japanese liked to play on words, and the written character for go away, saru, is pronounced in the same way as the character for monkey. So the monkeys became symbolic for driving away evil, and along the route from the palace to Hiei, carved monkeys protect the shrines from evil. In the same period, Buddhism came to Hiei. A priest who had been born on Hiei returned from China a monk with new ideas and built this temple at the top of the mountain. Before building the temple, the monks prayed to the kami for permission to fell the trees. This home of the sacred monkeys, high in the mountains, was one of the first mixing grounds for Buddhism and Shinto. By summer, much of the baby macaque's time is spent in play. Their mothers are quick to step in to defend them if play gets too rough. Under this protection, the offspring of high-ranking mothers find that they are soon able to dominate the young of females lower in the hierarchy, gaining a social status that will remain with them throughout their lives. They will stay close to their mothers until they're at least 10 months old, learning the survival and social skills they will need for independence. As the sacred monkeys were common in the hills around Kyoto, it is not surprising that the Buddhists chose monkeys to publicize some of their ideas. About a century after Buddhism arrived here, a monk came down to this temple in Kyoto. According to legend, he wrote a poem known as the Monkey Poem, because by playing with the words and images, he used monkeys to help explain its meaning. The Monkey Poem teaches that one should avoid bad influences, do not look at evil, or see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. These are the original wise monkeys of legend. The real origin of the three wise monkeys is shrouded in ancient mystery. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, the image received widespread popularity in Japan. Today in Japan, the three monkeys are linked with an obscure sect which originated in China, named Koshin. Followers believed that three evil worms lived in the human body, and on a certain night, known as Monkey Night, they escaped to report bad behavior to a heavenly being. The only way to stop the worms was to stay up all night. In the 10th century, Koshen nights were popular among aristocrats, and by the 15th century, the practice had become widespread. Sometime around this latter period, the more cheerful image of the three wise monkeys was adopted as an alternative symbol for the three evil worms. Koshen persisted as a folk belief in rural areas, and Koshen stones with carved monkey images can still be found scattered over the countryside. This belief is responsible for spreading the three wise monkeys all over Japan. In this remote southern peninsula, Koshen stones with their vantage point over the rice paddies are still visited by a few faithful. The rice harvest heralds a new season. For country and city people alike, the turning of the maple leaf to its final deep blood red is still symbolic of autumn. It is in autumn that the female macaques come into estrus. The males respond by becoming more aggressive. From the age of 3, juvenile males begin to leave the troop. They may spend a number of years as loners before becoming accepted by another troop. In this way, incest is avoided. It's the female hierarchy passed on to their daughters that maintains the troop's integrity. Grooming helps cement all social bonds between troop members. Males groom females more frequently at this time of year, often as a prelude to mating. As the leaves die, the macaques turn to new forage. Chestnuts, fungi, fruit, and berries become the staple diet of the troop. Now it becomes harder for the Japanese sorrow to find green leaves. In autumn, mother and calf gradually make their way down to the valleys. In October, Suzuki, one of the 7 grasses of autumn, flowers, a signal for people to flock to the national parks, such as Nikko, for autumn color viewing. Most of the tourists visiting Nikko will stop at the famous Toshogu Shrine. Horses are traditional gifts to shrines, and because a monkey was once believed to have cured an emperor's horse, monkeys were often placed with livestock to protect them. Above the stable at Nikko is the most famous carving of the three wise monkeys in Japan, if not the world. Toshogu was built in the 17th century in honor of the great shogun Ieyasu. Craftsmen from Kyoto and monks and priests from Mount Hiei traveled to Nikko to help set up the shrine, bringing with them the images of the three wise monkeys. In 1868, when Japan reopened her door to foreigners after more than 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation, it may well have been from this stable at Nikko that the image of the three wise monkeys spread to the outside world. Today, tourists of all nationalities come to observe the carvings, which reveal a panorama of the life cycle of monkeys. They carry both Buddhist and Confucian interpretations about how one should and should not behave. By late autumn in the north, snow has fallen on the mountain summits. The nuts and fungi are gone, and the macaques travel down the mountains in search of food. As they come lower into a land which once was theirs, they encounter more people each year. Japan's post-war prosperity has brought more roads and more people into the national parks. Many parks appear to be nothing more than recreational facilities for a people short of land. The reverence seems all but lost for mountains like this one, once highly sacred to both Shinto and Buddhism. And if the mountains are no longer sacred, then the people no longer need their monkey messengers. But the loss of habitat has a more direct effect on the macaque troops. Rice paddies have to be flat to hold water, and when they terrace the hills, the people first learn that landscapes can be altered. Naturalists blame the quarrying of their mountain home for bringing a macaque troop down to raid the crops of this village. Today, more than a third of Japan's 50,000 or so macaques live in areas where they come into contact with humans. Where crop raiding is persistent, licenses are granted to shoot or capture the offenders. Each year, some 3,000 monkeys are taken. Because of ancient monkey lore, many farmers prefer to trap them alive rather than kill them. They are then sold to zoos or to laboratories as experimental animals. Once monkeys are captured, there's no law to control what happens to them. Conflicts are most frequent in winter. 40% of Japan's forest is now commercially planted, most of it within the winter range of forest wildlife. These plantations are even-aged monocultures of conifers, biological deserts compared to the native deciduous forest. Naturalists estimate that only 5% of the original northern beechwoods remain, and their replacement by commercial plantations continues. In winter, the macaques gnaw the bark from deciduous trees. They cannot get the same sustenance from the conifers in plantations, although when desperate, they will try to find some nourishment in them. But to foresters, the most important pests are the black bears, which strip the bark, and the Japanese sorrows, which feed on the young shoots. Where black bears are considered pests, they are hunted with impunity. The sorrow, however, has been protected since 1955. Foresters say there are now too many, and since 1979, the government has issued licenses for around 1,000 sorrows a year to be shot. Even this has not satisfied some foresters. The government now plans to allow shooting anywhere outside 14 protected areas and the commercial sale of the fur. Conservationists say that most of these sanctuaries are too high. In winter, the sorrows will be forced down to become targets for both foresters and commercial hunters. In Hokkaido, Japan's far northern island, the large mammals face similar pressures. A biological divide separates Hokkaido from the rest of Japan. Here, many species are more closely related to Siberian animals. Hokkaido has no black bears, but the forest and mountains are colonized by brown bears. Mother and cub have a last romp before retiring to hibernate over the winter. The brown bear here belongs to the same species as our North American grizzly. It has an exaggerated reputation for killing people and livestock. But for the Ainu people, the native inhabitants of Hokkaido, the bear was one of their highest gods. Lord of the mountains, he could send deer or salmon to feed the people, and he gave his coat for warmth, his meat for food. His gallbladder is still highly prized for its use in traditional medicine. Before each hunting season, the Ainu celebrated the Bear Festival. They chanted to warn the gods that they were about to return a bear spirit to the god world. A bear was raised in the village from a small cub. It was the children's playmate until it grew too large. Filmed in 1977, this was one of the last festivals in which a bear was returned to the god world in this manner. The idea was to feast and to entertain the bear god. Then he would return to the God world with good memories of the Ainu village and recommend that others come to visit the people. At dawn, the bear was anointed and a symbolic arrow fired to help the spirit back to the God world. Today, with bounties on their heads, bears now die in greater numbers, not as gods, but as pests. By returning animals to the God world, the Ainu practiced a kind of spiritual game management. In the long term, their hunting and gathering lifestyle was more favorable to wildlife than agriculture, which displaces nature. In the late 19th century, Japanese pioneers, tired of the tiny fields on the main islands, came to farm the vast open spaces of Hokkaido. Today, its land is as heavily utilized as the rest of Japan's. The Japanese people are renowned for their traditional reverence for nature, yet they have a poor reputation for looking after their wildlife and habitats. This paradox may be partly explained by the farmers' need to clear forests and keep out wildlife. Only the aristocrats had time to develop an aesthetic appreciation of nature. But their appreciation was highly selective. Through the contemplation of nature, aristocrats, scholars, and priests found evocative images that symbolized their thoughts. They then heightened these chosen aspects of nature to better express their ideas, perfecting raw nature into a powerful but artificial symbolic world. These gardeners are clearing the algae from each stone, just as monks wanted to remove clutter from their minds so the unwanted debris of nature is removed. Bonsai turned the miniaturization of trees into an art. Over hundreds of years, they are pampered, pruned, and disciplined to grow into the desired form. A living plant is shaped to enhance the spiritual contemplation of the human mind. So in the cultured havens of the court, the aristocrats were sheltered from the reality of unrefined nature. Some Japanese say that because the people have always felt themselves just another part of the natural world instead of its master, they feel no responsibility toward it. They have had to cope with the ravages of earthquakes and volcanoes. Why then should not nature now adapt to the changes wrought by man? In their experience, nature, though fickle, was always rich and bountiful. Plants that were cut down reappeared the following season, and animals quickly recolonized devastated land. But Japan's most serious environmental problems arrived with Western industrialization. Western man always believed he was dominant over nature, which implied stewardship. The Japanese believed that they, their trees, and even their buildings were simply part of it. Still, the Western attitude toward conservation has developed only recently. Given time, the Japanese may soon realize they're losing something precious. Perhaps there is more ambivalence in the Japanese attitude to the monkey than to any other creature because of the similarities between macaque and man. Yet some Japanese scientists chose to put their special empathy with the monkey to use. In 1952, when the scientists began to feed the macaques of Koshima Island to encourage them out into the open, they discovered something which helped close the divide between humans and animals. The primatologists buried wheat grains in the sand to give them a chance to get close to individuals. At the same time, when Western scientists were being studiously objective and analytical, the Japanese were giving names to the macaques and concentrating on their individual characters. One such character was Emo. In 1953, she found that if she threw the wheat and sand mixture into the water, the wheat grains floated and she could easily scoop them up. In time, her siblings and children copied the behavior and spread it to their contemporaries. Gradually, this way of feeding became common within the troop. This discovery astounded international anthropologists. For the first time, the beginning and the spread of cultural behavior had been recorded in a non-human society. The macaques at Koshima were also fed sweet potatoes. The same resourceful individual discovered that if she took them to the water, she could wash the mud off. This behavior was also copied by her kin. Today, the macaques are fed clean potatoes, yet they still dunk them in the sea, possibly because they like salt on their potatoes. The Japanese primatologists believed that to ignore individual personality was to ignore the treasure. Their traditional Japanese ability to identify with the monkey helped them perceive these human-like innovations in behavior. Animal behaviorists worldwide have since come to recognize the significance of individual differences. But once people realized macaques would accept food, monkeys became a commercial proposition. Monkey parks opened all over Japan. Most city people's first encounter with a wild macaque is within one of Japan's 30 or so monkey parks. The macaques increased in number because of the new food supply, but they became dependent on it. Turned into pathetic panhandlers, they no longer inspired traditional respect. In the 1960s, a disturbing phenomenon occurred in the monkey parks. Monkeys were born with frightening deformities after their parents had been fed fruit contaminated with pesticides. Visitors to the park, especially young mothers fearing for their children, were able, in the Japanese way, to imagine themselves in the monkey's position. The empathy between humans and monkeys reached a peak. Pesticides were controlled and the scare evaporated, but the provisioned food has given new confidence to the macaques. Whether taking food from the monkey parks or from tourists or raiding crops, the animal that people have never quite come to terms with is definitely among them to stay. Even up in the remote, snowbound mountains, there are now few troops which do not come into contact with man. At night, when the temperatures plummet, the macaques make sleeping nests and huddle together in the trees. These particular snow monkeys belong to one of the most popular macaque troops. They're fed 3 times a day, and tourists from the nearby ski resort come to witness the event. A resourceful behavior has given these macaques worldwide fame. Submerging themselves in natural hot springs, they flee the freezing temperatures. The warmth will stay with the macaques for many hours, saving energy and helping them to survive the travails of winter. Far from its natural habitat, other amusing tricks come less naturally to the macaque. Even in the heart of sophisticated Tokyo, the showman's monkey attracts a crowd. These performances date back to the time when witch doctors traveled with monkeys. Later, they were patronized by the samurai, and they still appeal to the crowds of modern-day Japan. The trainer says that it's by treating the monkey as a human and constant companion that he's able to teach it to behave like a proper gentleman. Strict etiquette and the importance of good behavior have a long tradition with the Japanese. Some young people say that for them, this is what the 3 wise monkeys epitomize. They are certainly open to interpretation. The Japanese have been willing to sacrifice for the good of the country. After the war, they worked hard to rebuild Japan. It was not the time to bring attention to negative things, like the loss of so much natural beauty. For many, despite personal misgivings, it was more important to turn a blind eye to maintain the social order and harmony. The huge surge to the cities is only 30 years old. Today, people from all walks of life are questioning what is happening to the landscape. They realize that their traditional reverence for wildlife evolved when nature could replenish itself, and that now, against the progressive onslaught of industrialization, nature has little chance. Some of the younger generation are most active in the small conservation movement, which seeks to instill a new attitude toward the environment and promote laws which are favorable to wildlife. This group was formed with the specific aim of protecting the Japanese sorrow. Volunteers place nets over the shoots of young cypress trees in an attempt to protect them. On each visit, they take detailed measurements so they can calculate the extent of any damage. Their work is generally welcomed by foresters, but granting the sorrow complete protection is another matter. They face a hard task and say the situation will not improve until more people decide whether Japan's wildlife has any value in the modern world. The Japanese macaque, the mammal most easily observed in the wild and certainly the most endearing, may help more people to make that choice. At this monkey park on the outskirts of Kyoto, if visitors want to feed the macaques, they have to do so from inside a cage. Most visitors appreciate the irony. And in this park, away from the feeding cage, the macaques live a more natural and self-sufficient existence. Some local school children have formed a friendship group. Their friends are the macaques. They know all the individuals by name and their relationships with other members. They have a strong respect for the character and personality of each macaque. In 1983, a new cultural behavior was discovered in this troop. It was called stone playing, and primatologists found it difficult to explain in scientific terms of direct benefit or adaptive value. Finally, they came to the conclusion that the macaques play with stones simply because, like people all over the world, they sometimes feel like playing. It is the hope of concerned Japanese that these delightful primates can inspire a new conservationist ethic among their countrymen. Only when nature is honored as much for itself as for its symbolism and beauty will the living inspiration of so much Japanese culture survive. Next week, we continue our series with a look at Japan's relationship to the wildlife of the air. The elegant red-crowned crane, or tancho, is the bird of happiness, so called because of its leaping mid-air dance. An ever-present symbol in Japanese culture, but only recently saved from extinction by the people, the tancho has come to represent the struggle for survival many species now face. page for nature. And this is the image of Japan most of us know so well. The hustle and bustle of downtown Tokyo, the capital and heartbeat of what is now one of the most developed, most industrialized nations on Earth. And yet, there's a dramatic irony at work here. For all these busy city people carry within them an ancient love and respect for the natural world, everything that this busy district of urban Tokyo does not represent. This country of more than 3,000 islands is one of the most densely populated in the world. Yet it still has many square miles of magnificent forests and mountains. And the Japanese are saving special corners of their country for nature, like this national park at Nikko. But can they save enough? In this, our second program, we look at one of the many important species that is threatened. It's one of this country's great national symbols, the elegant red-crowned crane, known here as the bird of happiness. Red-crowned or Japanese crane, the bird of happiness, one of Japan's favorite symbols, a symbol which tragically has lost touch with the real bird. Painters, poets, and other artists used many wild creatures as evocative symbols. The eagle was popular with warriors because its arrogant and fierce appearance seemed to promise a proud strength of purpose. And the mandarin drake, which despite its finery remains faithful to the drab brown female, symbolizes married happiness. Today, about 380 red-crowned cranes breed in winter on Japan's most northern island, Hokkaido. They account for more than a third of the world's total population. Although in the past, many of Hokkaido's cranes flew south to winter in warmer parts of Japan, today they stay, making them all the more special to the local people. They roost and feed in rivers, which, fed by volcanic hot springs, continue to flow despite the freezing temperatures. Less than 20 miles away, the crane's breeding grounds, the marshlands which stretch along the southeast coast of Hokkaido, are locked in the grip of ice and snow. The thaw comes late to these northern marshlands. In April, the snowmelt floods the reed beds. And the arrival of whooper swans, stopping off on their way north to their own breeding grounds, signals that spring has arrived. woods surrounding the marsh regulate the flow of water into the reed beds and provide food and nesting habitat for other spring arrivals, songbirds like the yellow-breasted bunting and the lanceolated grasshopper warbler. But the cranes seem the lords of the marsh as they return to claim their territories on the old nesting grounds and wait for the water level to drop. Once they have formed a bond, a pair of cranes are constant companions, remaining faithful for life. They defend a breeding territory of 1 to 3 square miles, big enough to provide seclusion and enough food to support the family. This marshy setting helps protect the nest from predators, an asset appreciated as well by the egrets that also nest here. The female crane lays 2 eggs. The pair shares the job of incubation. While one remains at the nest, the other is away feeding. The eggs are vulnerable. The parent turns them to keep the temperature constant. A cold fog may chill the eggs, and water sometimes rises dangerously close to the nest. Winged predators like this black kite patrol the reeds in search of food for their own young. To the Ainu people who lived in Hokkaido before the Japanese settlers arrived at the end of the 19th century, the cranes were gods of the marsh. On festive occasions, Ainu villagers still dance to celebrate the revered qualities of the crane. Here, the girls rustle and lift their skirts, mimicking the crane's fearless defense of her eggs, weaving a charm to keep bears and other frightening things away. It's generally believed that the Ainu people once lived over much of northeast Japan. But by the 13th century, most of them had been pushed north to the wild lands of Hokkaido. They settled by forests, which gave them wood for their homes, and close to rivers, which provided fish. The Ainu were hunters and gatherers, taking what they needed from nature and no more. The animals and plants that were useful were believed to be gods bearing gifts. Good gods were rivers that brought plenty of salmon, or trees that made sturdy houses. Bad gods were trees that went rotten or rivers that drowned them. Hokkaido's high mountains, thick forests, and wide rivers were blessed with an abundance of wildlife. While the Ainu slept, they would have heard the comforting duet of the fish owls long through the night. The gift of the fish owl was his promise of protection over the village. Fish owls may have earned this role because Ainu villages were often within their territories. Like the Ainu, the owls also needed mature trees for their homes and the river for their food. But today, Blakiston's fish owl is extremely rare. There are only about 80 owls left in Japan, with perhaps another 40 in the nearby Russian islands. It's one of the biggest owls in the world, but little is known of its natural history. Usually, the fish owl catches its prey by pouncing from a low perch, but it can also plunge, osprey-like, from the wing. It supplements its diet with small mammals, birds, and frogs. The owl is now officially protected, but its breeding success remains poor. Eating fish contaminated with pesticides may be contributing to this problem. The Ainu believed that the fish owl was the first god to come down from the god world. In the past, people would periodically sacrifice a fish owl to return it to the god world. When the Japanese arrived here from Japan's more southerly islands, they cleared vast areas of forest for agriculture and fished heavily from the rivers. Like the American West, Hokkaido became a land for pioneer farmers and speculators. Later, many rivers became polluted. With fewer fish and trees, the owls almost disappeared. The few left today often call in vain as they search for a partner to complete the duet. The Ainu were encouraged to integrate and become Japanese. With the fish owls went their traditional way of life. Today, many Ainu are working to save their culture. In a few scattered villages, the symbols of that culture provide one of their principal livelihoods. With no land to hunt and no tradition of agriculture, the people live off tourism. Like the Ainu, the cranes also may once have lived over much of northeast Japan. The ancient chronicles speak of the land of the low reed plains, but gradually the breeding marshes were replaced by farmers' fields. The early Japanese did not persecute the crane. Instead, like the Ainu, they came to revere it. The incubation period lasts for around 32 days. The male and female change places with each other about 4 times a day. Shinto, the native faith of the Japanese, was especially inspired to worship beauty. It also stressed the importance of purity and cleanliness, and therefore was impressed by the dignified beauty, the pride, the grace, and the nobility of the Japanese crane. From the 6th century onward, Buddhism arrived from China and mingled with Shinto. At the same time, the Japanese openly adopted many facets of Chinese culture, importing new ideas which influenced their attitude toward many things, including wildlife. The aristocrats were attracted to the philosophical refinement of Chinese culture. It enhanced their well-developed awareness of the beauty to be found in nature. Inspired by the gentler side of nature, they created many of Japan's evocative arts. Buddhism brought a special reverence for all life. In Japan, it taught that every creature, from the lowliest of animals to the highest of men, was set on the path to enlightenment and might eventually become a Buddha. Spiritual merit could be gained by freeing caged birds and fish. The ancient custom is still practiced at this shrine near Kyoto. According to legend, one of the early shoguns released hundreds of cranes, each representing a soldier killed in battle. He is said to have declared that anyone killing a wild Japanese crane would face the death penalty. Art in the age of the shoguns, from the 12th to the 19th century, abounds with cranes. In China, the crane is a symbol of longevity, and the Japanese artists began to paint 1,000 cranes, one for each year of the crane's legendary lifespan. The symbolic powers of the crane were extended to include health, good fortune, and happiness. Although red-crowned cranes lay 2 eggs, they will raise only 1 chick. The second egg acts as an insurance policy should the first be lost to predators or inclement weather. The low reproductive potential of all crane species makes them highly susceptible to extinction. Once their population has been reduced, it can recover only slowly. The hatching of a chick creates an anxious time for the parents. Before they can move their chick to the relative safety of the reeds, they have to wait until it's strong enough to follow them. The unison call of a pair of cranes not only reaffirms the bond between them, but advertises their sovereignty over the breeding territory. After driving an intruder from the nest, the pair will burst into sound, each bird alternating its cry so that together they create the characteristic call. Today, any newborn chick is a small miracle. One of the most nostalgic tales to have come down the centuries is The Grateful Crane. Dramatized in this puppet play, a poor woodcutter rescues an injured crane. Shortly after, a beautiful young woman arrives at his home. She promises to weave silken cloth for him, provided he never watches her at work. But the man receives so much money and praise for the wonderful cloth that, overcome by curiosity or perhaps jealousy, his wife peeps in at her. The lovely maiden is the crane he rescued, and with a mournful cry, she flies away forever. In feudal Japan, falconry was the sport of the nobility, but by the 19th century, the days of the shoguns were numbered. During the shogunate, hunting was reserved as a privilege for the upper class, and hawks were their princely weapons. The shoguns allowed only 1 red-crowned crane to be killed each year by a hawk as a gift for the emperor's New Year's feast. But in 1868, Emperor Meiji established a new government. The age of the shoguns was over, and Japan began a process of modernization along Western lines. Sportsmen from Europe came to Japan to bag the game. The gun replaced the hawk, and at the same time as the new weaponry became widely available, the controls which had previously protected wildlife were abandoned. The next 25 years of largely uncontrolled hunting set many animals and birds on the road to extinction. The Japanese crested ibis, which caught its food in the rice paddies, was always unpopular with farmers. Now they hunted it as a pest and for food. By the end of the century, only 2 small groups survived. Protection may have come too late, for in the 50s, another Western scourge, pesticides, almost destroyed the ability of the few remaining ibis to reproduce. In the 60s, about the time these pictures were taken, scientists captured all the ibis they could. They hoped they would breed, but that project failed. In 1980, the last few wild ibis were captured in yet another attempt to get them to breed. Today, there are only 3 Japanese crested ibis in Japan and only 21 known individuals in the world. The same fate nearly befell the red-crowned crane. Everyone wanted to taste their meat, previously reserved for the emperor alone. By the early 1900s, it was thought to be extinct. The stylized crane of art and legend had become so strong an image that it had lost its links with the real bird. The bird of happiness had almost become a creature of legend. Yet as a symbol, the crane lived on. Because cranes stay with their partner for life, they're used to portray fidelity. This, with long life and happiness, makes them a favorite in the marriage ceremony. The power of the crane symbol continues to pervade many aspects of life in modern Japan. One bird that has become a symbol only in the last few years is the Okinawa rail. Discovered by scientists in 1981, it lives in the dense, swampy forests of Okinawa, the southernmost of Japan's semi-tropical Ryukyu Islands. While tourists cannot avoid noticing the symbol, very few people have caught a glimpse of the wild bird. There are thought to be about 1,500 Okinawa rails, and the bird has been given Japan's highest level of wildlife protection, that of a special natural monument. Because it moves very fast when disturbed, it has become a symbol of speediness or quick delivery. But although the rail is protected, its habitat is still threatened. It's just one of 5 species of birds and 15 mammals that are found on the Ryukyu Islands and nowhere else in the world. Far away from Tokyo, the islands escaped the first wave of industrialization, which swept over the rest of Japan. But today, they're faced with hundreds of development schemes. Money is being poured in with seemingly little thought for the traditions of the people, the beauty of the islands, or their unique native species. No one is sure, but there may be only 50 of these rare emerald doves living on 2 of the islands. The crested serpent eagle is at the edge of its range in the mangrove forests that fringe the rivers of these subtropical islands. The serpent eagle has to eject a pellet, the undigested remains of its last meal, before it can eat the crab. Pryor's woodpecker, even rarer than the rail, is also unique to the forests of Okinawa. It's another special natural monument whose habitat continues to be destroyed. Over much of Japan, it seems the lesson of the red-crowned crane, almost allowed to become extinct, may still go unheeded. It was in 1924 that hunters found the last few breeding pairs from a population of about 20 birds hidden in the vast peat marshes near Kushiro, Hokkaido. The parents travel to open pools to feed, where away from the shelter of reed beds, they keep a constant vigil. A pair of cranes will defend their chick fiercely. They have even been known to repel bears. Carrion crows and black kites are easily discouraged. But there are other marsh predators against which they have no defense. Although the Japanese crane has been a special natural monument since 1952, only a tiny percentage of their vital breeding grounds in Kushiro Marsh is protected, enough for about 7 pairs. There are plans, however, to make the marsh a national park. The people from the expanding city of Kushiro see the marshes in much the same way as people everywhere view wetlands, as unproductive and available wasteland, land they badly need. Saved from extinction, the growing population of cranes seeks out traditional nesting marshes. Sadly, they often find their ancient homes cut to pieces by roads or destroyed by other development. In 1982, a survey of known crane nesting sites revealed that more than half were threatened by agriculture. Drainage to improve the land for crops also extracts water from the adjoining marsh. As it dries out, scrub begins to choke the reeds, destroying its value as wetland and creating an excuse for further exploitation. Every year, more prime marsh is drained or disturbed, and the birds are pushed into more and more marginal habitats. All this encroachment has affected the crane population. From only 30 birds in the 1950s, the population grew rapidly. But in the 60s, the growth slowed. The cranes came into closer contact with development, and many were killed by man-made hazards. Recently, more adults have managed to survive, and the total numbers have risen again. However, the disturbing fact is that the number of young counted each year has not risen. More adults are not raising more young. The birds which are surviving to adulthood are unable to find vacant nesting territories. But there's another worrisome problem. A large number of eggs, as many as 30%, simply never hatch. As yet, there are no answers. The cause may be pesticide contamination of marsh waters, or perhaps inbreeding, a chilling legacy from the days when there were only 20 cranes. Throughout the summer, the crane chick learns from its parents, mimicking the way they catch food. Cranes are omnivorous, but prefer high-protein foods, insects, fish, frogs, and especially a small eel-like mudfish called a dojo. Chick mortality is high, but not unusual for cranes. 50% of the chicks may die before they reach 3 months. And just as the chick comes through one vulnerable period and is beginning to master one habitat, the marsh changes. In September, the reeds flower and seed. By October, they are tawny brown, and the crane's food supply begins to dwindle with the changing season. The cranes must now leave the relative sanctuary of the marsh to forage in the surrounding farmers' fields. At the beginning of this century, the flocks of cranes that migrated south were easy victims for hunters' guns as they gleaned grain in the fields. Scientists suspect that Hokkaido's cranes no longer travel south in winter because only those which did not migrate survived the autumn guns. In 1985, this chick, identified by its brown head, was one of only 32 which survived through to the winter, although 101 pairs nested. Families will remain together throughout the autumn, while cranes without young congregate in large flocks. A flock of flying red-crowned cranes is still symbolic of autumn, a reminder of the days when they migrated, like the waterfowl which still fly south, moving ahead of the oncoming snow. Whooper swans, great flocks of pintail, widgeon, and teal home in to the open water. Autumn also brings migrating songbirds, creatures that were once kept in cages for their beauty or their music. Yet, like many Europeans, the Japanese also traditionally eat them as yakitori, or grilled bird. Today, mist netting songbirds for food is illegal, and the yakitori sold in restaurants is usually made of chicken. Yet some 4 million songbirds are still captured and eaten each year. The Wild Bird Society of Japan has campaigned against the killing. Some members even masqueraded as poachers to provide evidence needed to tighten up the laws. In 1983, the Wild Bird Society began another campaign, this time to protect birds of prey from capture by falconers. In its Goshawk campaign, a local chapter used a series of alarms and barricades to keep a 24-hour surveillance on this nest, which had been consistently robbed. The efforts of this team received national media coverage and encouraged better protection of some eyries. But it is impossible to monitor every nest. A young goshawk can fetch more than $1,200 on the black market. The Wild Bird Society also watches over areas like Lake Furin in eastern Hokkaido. Cranes breed here, and it's an important feeding ground for wintering wildfowl. Each November, the Society organizes a birdwatching week, and in recent years, the sport has become increasingly popular. In 1981, the Society succeeded in having Lake Utenai in West Hokkaido set aside as Japan's first wild bird sanctuary. Since that date, it has received over 1 million visitors. But both people and wildlife need land, and the Society is aware that birdwatching is just the first step in gathering the support they need to save some of Japan's precious land for wild birds. The Society would also like to create a sanctuary at Lake Furin. They protested against a road which threatened to cut Furin's outlet to the sea. For the moment, construction has stopped. Volunteers from many parts of Japan have joined the Society's most ambitious project, the Crane Campaign, a concerted effort to save the wild cranes. They include in their plans other crane species which visit the south of Japan in winter. This group is clearing scrub from some unused rice paddies. Their work provides the visiting cranes arriving from Russia and China with somewhere safe to spend the winter. "800 miles south of Hokkaido, in the southwest of Kyushu Island, about 1,000 white-naped and 6,000 hooded cranes congregate each winter. In the past, they used to winter all over southwest Japan, but they were never accorded the special status of the red-crowned crane and were hunted with falcons and later shot. They survived in this coastal wetland because it was separated from the mainland by rivers. But during the war, they were killed by hungry people, and the land was reclaimed for rice and vegetable gardening. There were only a few hundred hooded and 25 white-naped cranes here in 1945, when a local farmer began to feed them. In the 50s, a protected area where the cranes could be fed was leased from farmers, and over the years, the crane numbers have increased dramatically. This wintering ground is crucial. The cranes that winter here today, apart from a small group further north, account for the total world population of hooded cranes and a third of the world's white-naped cranes. But they have become overcrowded and have begun to spill into the surrounding farmland, damaging crops. Farmers have tried to protect their crops with plastic covers and streamers, an expensive endeavor and not entirely successful. Many farmers think they should receive some compensation from the government for the damage done by the cranes. When negotiations have broken down, farmers have disturbed the protected area. The Wild Bird Society is searching for more areas to be set aside as wintering sites, but the cranes will always need the farmers on their side. Back north in Hokkaido, preparations are underway for the gathering of the red-crowned cranes on their winter feeding grounds. During the 60s and early 70s, up to 20 cranes a year were killed when they collided with power cables as they flew in to feed. The Hokkaido Electric Power Company began to mark the wires so the cranes could see them more easily. Now there are only 2 or 3 casualties a year. Snow falls across Hokkaido in December, and by January it blankets the fields. Some cranes always remained here throughout the winter. They probably survived by defending feeding territories near volcanic springs. But today, the cranes simply move across to farms where they are fed. In the freezing winter of 1950, it was a farmer who first gave some of his own corn to the cranes. 2 years later, school children fed the cranes, and the following year, they happily noted that more cranes returned. Winter feeding is credited with saving the crane population. It was farmers and their children who forged the first link, bringing together the people and the wild cranes once again. Mrs. Watanabe spends her winter feeding the cranes twice a day with grain provided by the government. The wintering cranes are popular, and local people are fiercely protective of them. Scientists have not yet been allowed to catch and ring the population at these feeding sites to learn more about them. However, the Wild Bird Society has now bought one of the feeding grounds to establish itself in the area. Each year, the local school children visit the feeding sites to count the total population. This year, they counted more than 380 birds. With such enthusiastic support, once a young crane has reached the wintering ground, its future seems assured. In a country not renowned for its record in wildlife conservation, the red-crowned crane could become its first success story. Conservationists, however, stress that too much emphasis is placed on the winter feeding grounds where the cranes are relatively safe, allowing the real problem, the destruction of habitat, to be ignored. Even the river where the cranes roost is being channeled and its flow controlled, turning it into a biological desert. In the new year, the cranes will begin their courtship dances, but few pairs will find a marsh where they can breed undisturbed. As winter turns harsher, foxes and crows are attracted by the grain and fish provided for the cranes. Competition can be fierce under winter's harsh discipline. Even sea eagles, forced by the encroaching sea ice to forage over land, are not above squabbling over scraps. While the cranes remain on their feeding grounds, January finds the sea ice drifting down from Russia, engulfing Hokkaido's northeast coast. 20 miles across this ice lie Russia's Kuril Islands. Red-crowned cranes have begun to extend their range into this forbidding landscape. 2 pairs have nested there recently. By February, the drifting sea ice pushes close against the shore. Whooper swans are forced to feed wherever they can find a gap. They're joined by other migratory waterfowl, such as pintail, widgeon, goldeneye, and mergansers. Sea eagles, like this magnificent Steller's eagle, ousted from their usual fishing grounds by solid ice, spend the day perched on the ice floes or soaring over watery gaps. As dusk approaches, the Stellers and the white-tailed sea eagles return to land to roost in the forested ravines. February is the best time to observe this ornithological wonder, for more than 2,500 sea eagles winter on this northeastern peninsula. In February, the morning temperatures on Hokkaido can drop to 15 degrees below zero, and the cranes don't leave their roosts in the hot springs for the feeding grounds until midday. Their arrival is anxiously anticipated. These photographers are trying to capture not only the crane's beauty, but an image that will incarnate their meaning to the Japanese people. But the crane will not be saved if it's only a symbol or an emotion in the hearts of the people. Despite her lack of natural resources, Japan is one of the world's greatest trading nations. But she faces increasing competition and would like to become more self-sufficient. The agricultural and building lobbies are far more powerful than the fledgling wildlife groups. The Wild Bird Society has only 17,000 members in a population of more than 120 million. Yet it is growing and has the potential to become the first conservation body with a political voice. Wedding halls run a thriving business. They freely use the crane symbol in their advertising. At this one in Tokyo, couples have a chance to give some of their money to buy land for the bird whose symbol accompanies them throughout their wedding. This century, the traditional story about the woodcutter who rescued a crane was turned into Japan's most popular opera. It's a story about human greed. The crane becomes the wife of the woodcutter and is forced to weave more and more cloth. The man struggles between his love for his crane wife and his desire for material riches. It is particularly poignant, for ultimately this same struggle will determine the fate of Japan's living cranes. Glowing with satisfaction at the money he's received, the man does not notice how thin and weak his crane wife is becoming. The end of the story has not changed. The crane disappears, and both crane and man have lost. The crane symbol is still evoked by school children who fold paper cranes as a charm against sickness and ill health. After the war, a young girl, a victim of Hiroshima's atomic bomb, began to fold 1,000 cranes as she lay in a hospital. School children from all over the country began making paper cranes in the hope that she would live. She died, her task only half completed. Thousands of schools contributed to her memorial in Hiroshima's Peace Park. Each year, children return, bringing their chains of folded cranes to remember and to pray for peace. The girl stands holding a paper crane high. Each year, new children come to know this powerful symbol. Today, conservationists would add a new prayer, that more people will reunite this beloved symbol with the living bird of happiness. There's a legend in Japan about Urashima, a poor boy who finds a turtle stranded on a beach, turned on its back by wicked children. Taking pity on the helpless turtle, which here in Japan is a symbol of longevity, Urashima turns it over and releases it. Then the turtle reveals her true identity. She's the daughter of the Dragon King of the sea. And in gratitude, she carries Urashima to her magical underwater kingdom, where many marvels are revealed. Join us next time when we too will follow Urashima's example and explore Japanese wildlife beneath the waves. I'm George Page for Nature. Tremendous variety, from an ordinary mackerel like this to this exotic spiny sea urchin. Definitely an acquired taste. It all started back in the 6th century, when the growing influence of Buddhism made the idea of eating meat abhorrent to the Japanese. In any case, their ancient reliance on the ocean for food has made it difficult for the Japanese to develop an empathy for sea life. The Japanese attitude toward whaling in particular has placed them in opposition to the rest of the international community. But today, the Japanese, like everyone else, know the sea's bounty is not unlimited. A dilemma which we explore in our film. In the beginning was the ocean. Two divine lovers plunged a spear into its depths. The drops fell and became the islands of Japan. These sacred rocks, known as the husband and wife rocks, represent the two mythological creators of Japan. Japan's more than 3,000 islands have nearly 20,000 miles of coastline. Her people have used the rich harvest of the sea more intensively than any other nation. It is spring when the loggerhead turtles appear as if from nowhere off the southern half of Japan's coast. They have not been seen since the previous summer, but each year they return to court and mate in the shallow coastal waters. The loggerhead is the third largest of 7 species of sea turtle, and it is threatened. Its shell, pitted from the many years in the sea, provides a useful platform for other sea creatures. The loggerhead is not a fish eater. Its basic diet consists of sea cucumbers and shellfish. Turtles sometimes get caught in fishermen's nets. They're considered divine omens, harbingers of a plentiful harvest. Perhaps this is because the loggerheads arrive with the same warm current which brings the schools of fish. Whatever the reason, these fishermen will not harm this traditional symbol of luck. Before releasing the sea turtles, they toast them with sake. But for a few modern fishermen, the turtle is simply another gift from the plentiful sea. Sea turtles are descended from terrestrial reptiles, but are so well adapted to life in the sea that it is only the need to lay their eggs on land which brings the females ashore. It's thought that once the males enter the sea, they never leave it. The females lay on sandy beaches in colonies known as rookeries. Vulnerable to land predators and sensitive to the high daytime temperatures, they emerge from the sea only at night. They haul themselves way above the high tide mark, where they dig a nest by scooping up the volcanic sand with their hind flippers. It takes about half an hour to dig a nest 2 feet deep. To eliminate the excess salt her body absorbs while in the sea, her tear ducts excrete a concentrated salt solution. They do this in the sea as well, but while on land, she seems to be crying. In Oriental lore, turtles are symbols of long life, believed to live for 10,000 years. This idea was reinforced by the fronds of algae attached to the shells of both freshwater and sea turtles. They reminded artists of old men's beards. Every schoolchild is said to love the legend seen here in one of Japan's earliest color cartoons. It's the story of a sea turtle and the fisher boy Urashima Taro. Urashima rescues the turtle from some school children who have been teasing it and releases it. A few days later, the sea turtle returns and invites Urashima to ride on his back. Together, they journey to the magical kingdom of the sea. Urashima is taken to the palace beneath the waves, where he meets the sea goddess. The sea creatures do their best to entertain and please him, and he decides to stay in this wonderful underwater world. First mentioned in 8th century chronicles, the legend of Urashima came from a little peninsula on the shores of the main island of Honshu. In Japan, every bay has its ancient legend, and many sacred rocks and islands have their own stories. Each year, dramatizing an ancient legend, the sea goddess is taken by priests through the sacred torii of Miyajima Island. Sea festivals which invoke the gods to deliver a good catch or to protect fishermen are still celebrated in hundreds of fishing villages all around Japan. Japan's islands range from subarctic to subtropical, and the seas provide a wide variety as well as an abundance of marine life. In the semi-tropical Ryukyu Islands, the coral reef forms the basis of the fisherman's livelihood. Corals are colonies of small sedentary animals which build a protective outer skeleton of calcium. Dead coral washes up on the shores of these islands, and traditionally it has been collected for use as a building material. Corals need clear sunlit waters because tiny single-celled plants living in their tissues need sunlight to produce carbohydrates. They're used to help lay down the coral's hard exoskeleton. The corals create a platform on which other plants and animals live, providing food, shelter, and layers for an incredibly diverse and interdependent community of creatures. Only 3 miles of reef-infringed coast yields 8 seasonal varieties of seaweed and at least 50 edible species of fish for the villagers of Shiraho. Turtle eggs traditionally provided a welcome seasonal protein source for some coastal villages. Today, the eggs can be bought from Tokyo's fish market and at a few specialty restaurants. During the early summer, the female loggerheads emerge to lay their eggs. Each female will nest 2 or 3 times a season at 2-week intervals. On each visit, a female lays about 100 soft-shelled eggs. Experiments have shown that the temperature of the nest determines the sex of the hatchlings. This makes the positioning of the nest and the amount of sand covering the eggs crucial. Finally, the female turns to disappear back into the ocean, leaving the eggs to develop unattended. Freshwater turtles have long been eaten for their fabled rejuvenating powers. In the 70s, a health fad popularized eating sea turtle eggs. In some areas, poaching increased. Poachers can easily follow the tracks of every female. By the 80s, eggs were selling for $45 per 100. People monitoring one beach in Kyushu discovered that all the eggs were taken, and they began to protect the beach. In the town of Hiwasa on Shikoku Island, the people have been protecting their turtles since the 50s. In 1985, they opened Japan's first sea turtle museum. The effort to protect sea turtles was started by some school children who had seen people taking turtles and eggs for food after the war. The children cleared the beach of rubbish which might entangle the turtles and began to monitor the nests. Some years after this initiative, children from a nearby school began a conservation and research project. Working with the advice of prominent experts like Dr. Uchida, the eggs are collected from 1 or 2 nests. The children put them in a homemade hatchery. The eggs are placed in crates where conditions mimic those in the nest as closely as possible. The children wait 2 months for the eggs to hatch. The hatchlings can then be released into the relative safety of the sea. The Ryukyu Islands are widely advertised as Japan's own tropical paradise, and in the summer they've become popular with young people, especially honeymooners. Turtle eggs hidden above the high tide mark can coexist with vacationers, provided there is little disturbance of the sand. But it's the actual building of tourist facilities and other development on the beaches which has a negative impact on the turtles. Land suitable for development is scarce, and the coast is seen as a potential area for reclamation. Less than half the coast surrounding the Ryukyu's 4 main islands is still in its natural state. At Shiraho, the government plans to create land for a large airport by dumping earth and rocks from a nearby hill over the living coral reef. The project has been held up by the determined efforts of protesters from the village. After an anti-airport demonstration, Mrs. Oshima, one of the protest leaders, praised to the sacred rocks at the proposed airport site. The villagers have been fighting the destruction of their reef for 8 years. While the people of Shiraho demonstrate to protect their coast, those in Hiwasa celebrate their victory. They have succeeded in receiving official protection for their turtle rookery. Each summer they hold a festival in honor of Urashima, the legendary fisher boy who rescued the sea turtle. News that Hiwasa was protecting its turtles soon spread. Today, people come from far and wide to watch the turtles lay their eggs. Once the turtles begin to lay, it's difficult to disturb them, so the crowds of well-wishers are allowed on the beach. Hiwasa's effort may have come in the nick of time for Japan's loggerhead population. Today, only 6 major rookeries remain, visited by perhaps 1,000 turtles. As the last females disappear into the ocean, the first eggs of the season begin to hatch. The hatchlings use their flippers in a paddling motion to climb to the surface. Amazingly, they slow down when the temperature rises, which helps ensure that they emerge at night, when they are less visible to predators and less likely to dry out on the way to the water. Instinctively, they orient themselves by the faint glimmer of light reflected from the sea surface. In Japan, they have few natural land predators. Most of their problems are associated with having people nearby. Some are eaten by cats and dogs. Sea flotsam, or rubbish, can prevent others from reaching the sea, and many are disoriented by the artificial light of street lamps and houses. The egg yolk provides enough energy for them to paddle hard for 2 days, enough time to get away from the dangerous coastal waters. Then they drift with the currents, but no one is sure where they go. Little is known about their biology at sea, but it's thought that they may pick up vital chemical signals in their first few hours, which enable the females 15 years later to find again the beaches where they themselves were hatched. In the Ryukyu Islands, silt released by development is killing marine life simply by blocking the sunlight and smothering the coral. Huge areas of reef are already dead, as much as 80% of that surrounding Okinawa, Ryukyu's main island. And once the reef dies, fish disappear. Because of pollution, overfishing, and increased demand, the seas around Japan no longer supply the nation's needs. In Tokyo, this is the world's largest fish market, and Japan is the world's largest consumer of marine products. Today, much of this fish is imported or caught in international or foreign waters, and Japan's growing appetite has caused friction with other fishing nations. But it's the consumption of whale meat, traditionally regarded as fish and sold in the fish market, that has brought Japan far greater criticism. Although the Japanese have been hunting whales off their own coast for centuries, it wasn't until 1934 that the first Japanese ships began whaling in the Antarctic. They bought factory ships from the great whaling nations like Norway and learned how to use gun-fired harpoons from America. After the war, Japan had 7 fleets in the Antarctic. One mothership could support 20 catcher boats and kill 10 to 50 whales a day. Each year, it was a free-for-all in Antarctic waters as the Japanese competed with the United States, England, Norway, and the Soviet Union to catch as many whales as possible before the international quota was met. In the post-war period, whale meat was a cheap source of protein and was served for school meals. Many Japanese had their first taste of whale meat in school lunchrooms. Millions of Japanese, however, do not eat whale and would be unaffected if Japan stopped hunting them. But whale meat, though no longer cheap, is readily available, and some people eat it simply because they like it. In the 17th century, the villagers of Taiji on the Pacific coast discovered that they could capture passing great whales using nets. They sent the best cuts to the imperial court, and nothing was wasted. Whale oil mixed with vinegar was used as a pesticide on rice paddies, and any remains became fertilizer. It was said that one whale would keep 7 villages through the winter. Taiji's culture and livelihood developed around whaling. In the summer, they hold a festival in honor of the whale. The boys sing of the bravery and glory of the whalers. They have performed in various parts of Japan as part of Taiji's campaign to encourage support for its need to continue whaling. The whalers say they have great respect for the whale. They hold ceremonies to pray for the souls of the whales they have caught. They say they follow strict quotas, keep good records of the numbers caught, and would hardly allow such an important resource to become extinct. Today, fewer than 5,000 people obtain their living from the whaling industry. Each year, as the whalers leave for the Antarctic, they must wonder if it will be their last. In 1982, the anti-whaling nations of the International Whaling Commission voted to stop commercial whaling for all the great whale species in 1986. Under heavy international pressure, including the threat of American fishing sanctions, which would affect her economy far more than the loss of whaling, Japan has finally agreed to stop commercial whaling for the great whales at the end of the 1987 season. But Japan continues to exhibit a tremendous desire for many other kinds of wildlife products which it imports. Most of the pink coral and exotic shells sold to tourists in the Ryukyu Islands are now brought in from Taiwan or the Philippines. Japan is second only to the United States as an importer of wild animals or their products, but it leads the world in imports of products from endangered species. Much of this trade supplies traditional crafts such as coral, leather, or ivory work. But the demand for modern status symbols has expanded the trade in exotic species. In 1980, Japan signed CITES, an agreement which regulates international trade in endangered species. But members can take a reservation on any species with which they wish to continue trade. Japan took reservations on 14 species in the most endangered category, more than any other nation. The Japanese also trade in wildlife products from native species. Black bears are killed for their gallbladders, but they import them as well. They're used in Oriental medicine, another tradition for which Japan continues to import endangered species. Besides loggerheads, a few green turtles and an occasional hawksbill come to the Ryukyu Islands to breed. Like whaling, Japan's exploitation of sea turtles is tied to her traditional culture. In the far south, fishermen occasionally caught turtles to be stuffed as a symbolic gift promising health and long life. But about 10 years ago, tourists began buying stuffed turtles as souvenirs. While some are still taken in Japan, most are now imported from as far away as the Caribbean. When Japan signed CITES, she took reservations, allowing her to continue importing 3 species of threatened turtles. In 1985, an estimated 10 to 18,000 stuffed juvenile hawksbills, killed before they ever had a chance to reproduce, were imported for sale to tourists. The hawksbill is one of the most severely endangered species of sea turtle. From the 17th to the late 19th centuries, when Japan was closed to foreigners, Nagasaki remained open for imports. Today, it's still the center of the tortoiseshell or Beko industry. The shell of the loggerhead is too fragile to work, and the hawksbill shell has been imported since the 17th century, when Beko first gained widespread popularity. This family business has seen 8 generations of master craftsmen. A design is sketched, the pieces selected, cleaned, shaved, and cut to shape. Pieces are fused together by clamping them between hot tongs, then dousing them in cold water. No glue is used and no joints are visible. The more valuable gold pieces come from the shell on the turtle's underbelly. With the advent of plastic, the popularity of Beko began to wane, but the industry attracted the luxury fashion market with modern designs for jewelry and eyeglass frames. Today, there are about 100 Beko companies in Nagasaki. Since CITES, Japan has limited her imports of tortoiseshell to 30 tons per year. This figure represents some 30,000 hawksbill turtles, accounting for 90% of the known trade in this highly endangered species. The third industry which imports turtle products, the leather industry, lacks the aristocratic status enjoyed by the Beko craftsmen. In medieval Japan, because of the Buddhist ethic against harming animals, killing them was considered the lowest of tasks. Japan's butchers and tanners were at the very bottom of the class system. Turtle leather is only one of the many exotic leathers worked in Japan. But each turtle provides only a tiny amount of leather from the flippers and neck. And in 1985, the industry imported the skin of an estimated 50 to 80,000 olive ridley and green sea turtles. Although both these species are endangered, distributors and retailers of the prosperous fashion industry are pressuring the government to maintain the supply of exotic leather. Since Japan signed CITES, her turtle imports have decreased, but she remains the largest importer and has been accused of keeping alive the world trade in sea turtles. However, Japan is also supporting conservation projects like this one. Eggs are hatched and raised before release into the sea, hopefully giving more of the hatchlings a chance to survive. The turtle-based industries would like to support more hatcheries, but conservationists are wary of such proposals. We don't yet know when or how turtles imprint on their rookery beaches. Removing eggs from their nests may somehow interfere with the process. Given the turtle's long maturation period, it would take at least 15 years to learn if something in the hatchery process had disrupted their instinctive homing ability, jeopardizing whole generations of turtles. Even without man's interference, most young turtles will never see their natal beaches again. Gradually, international pressure seems to be closing the doors on Japan's trade in endangered species. This has inspired a movement toward greater self-sufficiency. But the Japanese will always rely heavily on foreign trade, which helps make them responsive to international pressures on issues like whaling. Taiji's pride is built on catching large whales, but her people began taking small whales and dolphins about 800 years ago. Whenever the great whales disappeared from Japan's waters, as at the end of the 19th century when European and American boats depleted their numbers, Taiji's fishermen have returned to catching the small species. The boats set off whenever a school of pilot whales or dolphins is sighted. At least 20 species of small whales and dolphins appear off Japan's coast during the year. Very little is known about their biology and numbers, and without this vital information, responsible management is impossible. Yet the fishermen of Taiji are trying to conserve the stocks. They have voluntarily restricted the hunting season. Making use of the animals' protective herding instincts, the boats surround them and drive them inshore. To generations accustomed to buying their meat in supermarkets, the slaughter of animals is always shocking. But this is especially true when a strong emotional bond exists between man and animal. In the West, dolphins are embraced as kindred minds in the water. However, to these Japanese fishermen, with a centuries-old tradition of hunting them, dolphins are just another seasonal source of food. It is culture, not biology, that dictates which animals are revered and which are eaten. In the next bay, around from where the dolphins are slaughtered, is a marine park. The fishermen make no attempt to hide their work from tourists, who can witness both spectacles in the same day. The Japanese do make a clear distinction between dolphins and whales. Many Japanese are dolphin lovers and would never think of eating them. Yet an estimated 30,000 small whales and dolphins are killed each year off Japan's coast, though no accurate records are kept. While some of the dolphins are killed and then used as fertilizer because they compete directly for fish, many are taken specifically for food. Most dolphin meat is sold and eaten locally, where tradition sanctions the practice. There has been concern that Japan will increase its take of dolphins when it joins the moratorium on hunting the great whales in 1988. But those who enjoy eating whale are not especially likely to switch to dolphin. It tastes different. Under the influence of Buddhism, which discouraged the killing and eating of meat, seafood became essential to the Japanese diet. Then, in the 19th century, Japan adopted the Western custom of eating beef and pork. But she has little spare land for raising domestic animals, and about half of her animal protein is still provided by fish. In this town on the northeastern coast of Hokkaido, winter lasts for 5 months of the year. But the harvest never stops. It simply changes with the season. In summer, they take kelp. In autumn, salmon. And in winter, equipped with steel-hardened boats that can break through the ice, they catch 80,000 tons of pollock. They turn to harvesting pollock when overfishing seriously depleted the squid population in these waters. Through intensive fishing and hunting, coastal reclamation, and tourism, Japan is increasing the pressure on her seas. Today, campaigns like the one to protect Shiraho's coral reef are drawing attention to the marine world. But despite its reliance on the sea, Japan has no national organization focusing on marine conservation. Japan's small but dedicated conservation movement is gradually drawing support in its efforts to save the red-crowned cranes. The movement is campaigning on many fronts, but it is not easy to be a conservationist in Japan, and the movement needs all the support it can get. One powerful force that conservationists are drawing upon is wildlife's strong traditional place in Japanese culture. The special Japanese reverence for wildlife, revealed in their arts and religion, has much to teach the world about the value to be gained from nature. In modern Japan, these ancient traditions could become the basis of a conservation attitude for many people, rather than so few. The tale of Urashima, the boy who rescued the turtle, has a cautionary ending. The sea goddess gives him a box, which he promises not to open. After 3 years in the sea, the turtle carries him home to his village. But the village is strange and no one recognizes him. Longing for the delights of the sea, he breaks his oath to respect the law of the sea goddess and opens the casket. But his 3 years in the sea were really 300. Instantly, he is turned into an old man. Should a sea turtle of 300 years ago return to Urashima's village today, he would find he is still the symbol of long life, but that he is alone. Sea turtles no longer breed there. The decision to protect the loggerheads brought fame and prosperity to the people of Hiwasa. They asked the government to give their beach official wildlife protection status. Hunting turtles is now banned in this county, and children from 7 schools take part in projects associated with protecting or researching sea turtles. So many biological questions remain unanswered. Where do the hatchlings go to feed and mature? It's difficult to devise a safe tag for such a tiny sea creature. These will fall off as the shell grows. Records of tagged sea turtles are rare because even adults are seldom sighted once they're out in the ocean. The hatchlings are released immediately, for it's not known when they pick up the vital signals which will guide them back as adults to breed on these beaches. Once they have left Japan's coastal waters, they are unlikely to be seen again until 15 years later, when, if no mishaps befall them or this beach, they will return to mate and lay their eggs.